words, in fact came to India through the Lascari dialects. Balti, for example, which is a famous Portuguese word. It's impossible to think of India today without the Balti, but Balti actually meant a ship's bucket, which was a leather contraption. And so many other... one of the very interesting things about this is the word kamra. If you think about it, kamra means room in Hindustani, many other Indian languages. But what was the word for the internal division of space in India before that? We don't really know, because kamra actually began by meaning ship's cabin. Again, it's a word, it's camera really. It's adapted from the Portuguese and passed on to the Indian languages. So in both these ways, you have this sort of very intricate fusion, the Lascars acting as a kind of filter between in these two directions. Now, one of the things that really does interest me very much about the Lascars also is why so many of them were from the East Coast. Of course, many were also from the West Coast of the Indian subcontinent, but those who were from the West Coast were mainly Kutchis, Gujaratis, and so on. A lot of Goans, a lot of Sri Lankans, but many, disproportionately, they were Bengali. And of course, it makes sense that Bengal is a deltaic landscape. There were boats. There was a sort of familiarity with ships, with sailing. But I think there's another reason for that. And in some, my intuition about this comes from my own family. My family is from Bangladesh. It's from the district of Bikrampur in Bangladesh. But our family legend says that in fact they were originally from Borishal, which is another district in Bangladesh. So they moved from Borishal to Bikrampur. Then in 1856 they left Bikrampur and moved further upriver. They moved to Patna. They moved to Chhapra, which is in Bihar. We went back to look for the village that is thought of as the ancestral village in Bikrampur. And when we went to look for it, of course, it was under the river. And it had been under the river, people said, for over 100 years. And I'd often asked myself why my family started moving like that. And when I saw that, I realized why. It was because the village was buried. It was drowned. And I think this is one of the reasons why there is such a sense of a kind of unsettled landscapes within Bengal. I think it's an ecological thing that, the movements of the rivers actually have often created what you would call today ecological refugees. And this goes back, generations, really millennia. And I think about this a lot because I contrast it with the west coast of India, where, of course, which is in many ways a very fortunate coast. It's not subject to these great tidal invasions. It's not subject to cyclones so much, though there was a cyclone this year for the first time in centuries. But, if you look at, say, Hindu families from Goa, for 200-300 years, they preserve the memory of the family temple, to which they'll go back, even though they were driven away during the Inquisition, but they preserve the idea of the family temple, of that family link. This link, I don't think, exists even notionally within, say, Bengali Hindu families. It's lost very early. And I think this is, in some sense, a part of the of that adaptation, to the ecology of that landscape. Well, I'm almost running out of time, but one of the things I wanted to talk about today is about the notion of belonging and diaspora, because, when we use the word diaspora about, say, South Asians, there's a sense in which we are thinking about something which is uncommon or unexpected. That movement becomes something that is unexpected in certain peoples. Now, as I've said, the Lascars, the story I told you to begin with, these sailors, for them, movement is anything but unexpected. It's the normal condition of their life. And the more I look at my own family history, I realize that that's been the condition of my family for centuries, that we've always been on the move, moving from Bengal into Bihar, into Burma, into many other places. So the question that arises for me is that why do some societies have diasporas and others have settlers? What is the thinking behind this? And if we think about this, the question that arises, first of all, is, after all, the biggest diaspora in all of human history, perhaps, is the Anglo diaspora that comes out of England, which over a period of 2 or 3 centuries really changes the demographic map of the whole world. It settles the North American continent, it settles Australia, New Zealand. So many countries are actually, the entire demography of these countries is radically altered. So, but we, on the other hand, we never ever speak of an English diaspora, really. I mean, who does? Nobody does. No one speaks of an Anglo diaspora, but people speak of other diasporas. So what is at stake here? And I think one of the things which is at stake is really this idea of, which comes about in colonial thinking in the late 19th century, where you have Sir Henry Maine and so on theorizing this idea of the native as a settled person, the local and the native as being the settled person, as opposed to the universal person who gets to travel the world freely or gets to inhabit the world freely, and for whom the world is a part of a history that is continuously in the making. So let's think of this idea of belonging, not from the point of view of, say, people like South Asians or Chinese, for example, but from the point of view of, say, the Ur diaspora, the Anglo diaspora. What does belonging mean in that? What does belonging mean in that model? Now, the reason I ask this is that when people come out of South Asia or out of China into Europe or into other sort of settled, other nation states, the idea seems to be that in some way they're out of place, they have come to a new place, and that they have to sort of find some modality of belonging, a modality of belonging that is specific to their circumstance. And of course, this model of belonging is one that conforms to the idea of a nation state. That is, that the migrant has arrived in a place that has its settled laws, languages, custom, and usage, and that the migrant must in some way exchange one set of loyalties for a new set of loyalties, But what if you look at this idea of belonging from the point of view of let's say, Anglo culture? What happens within Anglo culture when you have this enormous dispersal? And after all, some of the foundational nation states, the USA was, after all, largely settled by Americans at that, by English settlers at that point. Now, what happens in these circumstances? Now, we know that within, say, Australia, for an Australian, of course, there's a very powerful sense of belonging to a nation state, but there's also a sense of belonging to something wider, which is, to use Winston Churchill's words, an English-speaking peoples, or a wider community, which actually reaches very widely across the planet. There's a sense of having a kinship with, say, Americans, with Canadians, with New Zealanders, and so on and so forth. And, if you take this idea of exchanging loyalties, it's a curious thing that if you look at it in the colonial context, if you look at it even, say, in terms of organizations, we have many instances of Europeans and English people taking jobs with native states. For example, the King of Burma hired some Italian engineers and so on, and many, in the mid and late 19th centuries, many states were trying desperately to modernize, and they took on, many floating populations of Europeans as engineers, as gunners, and so on. And the curious thing is that these people entered this organization, but at every critical moment of any battle, they always sold out those organizations. Their loyalties, in some sense, were never exchanged, nor indeed could they ever have been exchanged. If you think about it, I mean, suppose the English army marches into Burma and finds that there's an Englishman over there advising the King of Burma on how to attack English armies. What would they have done to him, So, in that sense, this idea of loyalty, it's a very curious one. I mean, how is it that we theorize this idea of loyalty in this way within a nation state, which is actually in some way not a nation state, because it has a much wider sense of extraterritorial affiliations and alliances and allegiances. So, what I think is actually happening today is that we are in a period when the idea of the nation state itself is fading, you know, frankly, I'm one who will mourn the nation state because I think there are many good things about the nation state, the things that we don't recognize and which only in its absence will we recognize as valuable and important things. But the fact is that it's fading. It's fading in many different directions. It's fading at the top, where you have say the EU. It's one way in which it's fading. Similarly, you have these unspoken allegiances, as in say the settler